excited to have him here. You know, it means a lot to myself and my family to not just remember history, but preserve it and pass down the lessons of history to not ourselves, but future generations. So everyone here, you know, is taking part of that as well, and thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's event. I apologize, I do have to run out with a prior obligation, and I regret that. But from here, I hope everyone has a Merry Christmas, a happy holiday season, and a Happy New Year. So thank you.
Hi, I'm John Zanuzzo, the president of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. Vinny, among his many hats, is a trustee of the Battlefield Park Alliance. So it's particularly appreciated how much time he gives the Alliance and the donation of this space that his hotel is providing to us as well. So we thank them, and we thank Jen and the whole team here at the Holiday Inn Resort for hosting us today. Now, this is the last program the Alliance is initiating this year, and it's been a terrific year for us. I know many of you are members of the Alliance, and we hope more of you will become members after today. But we've had a whole host of great programs. We had one on Philip Schuyler and Michael Barrett, a member historian who presided over that presentation, is here with us today. Mark Silo, another member historian, did a terrific amount of research on just defining where Johnson's lines were during the Battle of Lake George in 1755. They extend from the battlefield park all the way over to Route 9 and probably in the front lawn of the Holiday Inn here. Mark's defining work is available. It was published in our newsletter. It's available online, and he conducted tours for our members and then for the public later in the year. We had a presentation on the presence of Native Americans in the region, another on James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohegans, and it's another, you know, incredible honor to be part of this organization in history in Lake George, because you know, when we spoke on that topic, August the 3rd at Fort William Henry, that was the actual date that the French started launching their cannons against the British at Fort William Henry. We were on the same grounds that was happening. Just amazing. We had a presentation on the Battle of Lake George to kind of kick off the encampment and reenactment that happened in September, co-sponsored with Fort William Henry and the French and Indian War Society. And then in October, we dedicated a new historical marker commemorating Carleton's raid, which ultimately destroyed Fort George, which is within our battlefield park. And actually, the first event over the past 12 months we had was a commemoration of Knox and his noble artillery train from Ticonderoga to Boston, during which he stayed at Fort George in our park on the way up and again on the way back. That presentation was held in this room by the curator of Fort Ticonderoga, co-sponsored by the Warren County Historical Society. The following day, other from Fort Ticonderoga came and educated the 7th grade at the high school, junior high, about that noble endeavor. Our next program, January 13th, right after the first of the year, will be on Knox again, and the letters he wrote to his wife during that noble artillery train. And again, we're going to have a distinguished speaker, Philip Hamilton, who's authored a book on those letters that Knox and Mrs. Knox, Lucy Knox, exchanged during that noble artillery train. You're on our mailing list, so you'll receive a notice in the next few days about that event, so you can put it on your calendars. A lot more is planned. I won't go through the litany what we do have planned, but we're going to have a presentation, hopefully in April, on Peter Gansford, who was the commander at Fort George, and later went on to some very noble activities on behalf of the Continental Forces in the Mohawk Valley. We have a history cruise that we're planning, through which we'll have a narration on the south end of Lake George and meandering up a couple of miles from the head of the lake to talk about some of the sites along the lake shore and in the lake associated with the wars of the 18th century. And we just met yesterday with Lake George Historical Association to jointly do an initiative of restoring, refreshing, repainting where needed the historical markers within the town, some of which are in need of repair. So it's a nice joint initiative, a community benefit. Some other things, we're looking at Bloody Pond. There's going to be an article on Bloody Pond and whether the marked site on Route 9, a couple miles south of here, is the true Bloody Pond site. And we have we have an alternative that historians through the years have postulated might be the real Bloody Pond. We're going to have a very good article and hopefully a program on that topic coming up. So a lot is planned, and I just want to familiarize you with some of the works we do. You've seen our literature outside. I hope you'll avail yourselves of that and become active with us. Hopefully become a member, but certainly continue to participate in our programs. We have a lot in store. The Visitor Center will reopen in May. We've had over 5,000 guests attend the Visitor Center since it opened, and we're very proud of that. And two final things before I turn the mic over to Bob Wilcox. Number one, buy the book. Bruce Bender, one of our trustees, always says at his conferences. I've read this book. I'm going to get another one to give, at least one, as a gift today. It is first-rate American history, and we're very honored that Jack is joining us so soon after the publication of it. The second reminder is to just, enjoy yourselves and learn about our history, support our history in every way you can. It's very important. So, thank you. A fellow trustee, Mr. Bob Wilcox, will introduce our featured speaker today. Bob?
John's brief recitation of history in this area resonates because it's incredible the amount of history that's right here, right outside the door. I mean, literally across the street, and all up and down the Hudson River corridor. So get involved. It's a lot of fun, and you'll learn a lot. With respect to our speaker today, Mr. Kelly is a journalist, a novelist, historian, whose books include The Band of Giants, which received the DAR's History Award Medal. He has contributed to national periodicals, including the Wall Street Journal, and is a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow. He has appeared on the History Channel and interviewed on National Public Radio. Jack's latest book, God Save Benedict Arnold, builds on his earlier work, Valcour, which analyzed Arnold's successful strategy in 1776 to halt the British ambitions for moving south on Lake Champlain toward Albany. He grew up in a town in the Canal Quarter adjacent to Palmyra, Joseph Smith's home, and he lives in New York's Hudson Valley. Ladies and gentlemen, Jack Baker. Or Jack Baker.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, John, for all the work you put in organizing this event. The Battlefield Alliance. I always say it's great to come to the place where it happened because it makes it much more real, and I think people are familiar with the geography and what the basics of what happened in their area, and can relate to the Revolutionary War for that reason. And thank you all for coming out today. I want to start out by taking a little show of hands. Just raise your hand if you've never heard of Benedict Arnold. Okay, so Benedict Arnold has more name recognition than any other soldier that fought in the Revolutionary War other than George Washington. Everybody knows him. And everybody that knows him knows one thing about him. I'm not going to say what that is because you know what it is. But I wrote the book in order to get across the idea that there's more to Benedict Arnold than that one thing, and that it's important to understand Arnold in order to get a clear view of the Revolutionary War. Arnold really makes a good portal into the early years of the war because he was involved in almost every one of the major operations in the early part of the war for the first 3 years. So I'm going to cite some examples that I talk about in the book of Arnold's achievements. My book is not a biography of Benedict Arnold so much as a manifesto or a making the case for Arnold. I sometimes think of it as Benedict Arnold's greatest hits. The Revolutionary War began on the morning of 19th of April, 1775, when Redcoats shot and killed 8 Minutemen at Lexington Green, and the Patriots came back and killed more than 70 of the King's soldiers, and the war was on. 3 weeks later, Benedict Arnold captured the most strategic fortification in the 13 colonies at Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And he not only captured the fort, but he, on his own initiative, without orders, he went up into Canada and captured a sloop of war that was the only British warship on Lake Champlain, thereby secured the lake for the Patriots and protected Ticonderoga from being quickly retaken. And the question is, was that a significant achievement? I think it was, because for the first 2 years of the war, the British strategic objective was this water corridor that goes from Montreal down Champlain, down Lake George, Portage over the Hudson River, and down all the way down to New York. That was pretty much the superhighway of the colonies. The roads were either bad or non-existent at that time. So the British thought that by capturing that corridor, they could split the colonies, isolate New England, and win the war. The obstacle was Fort Ticonderoga, right in the middle, almost in the middle of that corridor, that prevented them from doing that. In addition, during the winter of that year, as John referred to, Henry Knox took the guns from Fort Ticonderoga. They dragged them all the way across on sleds across the state of Massachusetts and gave George Washington his first victory of the war by driving the British out of Boston. So it seems like the capture of Ticonderoga was a very big deal, particularly in the early days of the war. But if we look at the history books, it's barely a footnote. It's not given much importance. And the credit, if credit is given, is often given to Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. And it's true that the Green Mountain Boys did provide the manpower to take over Ticonderoga. They were a vigilante group, of course, that Ethan Allen had gotten up before the war, really having nothing to do with the dispute with England. But after the excitement was over at Ticonderoga, the Green Mountain Boys basically went home. And Ethan Allen, if you look at his leadership of that operation and his participation in the war overall, I don't know. I don't know if I would have named a furniture company after him. but they do love him up in Vermont, so that's all I'm going to say. The idea for the takeover of Ticonderoga was Benedict Arnold. The leadership was Benedict Arnold. And most importantly, the initiative to gain control of Lake Champlain was all Benedict Arnold. So that raises a question, do we owe it to Benedict Arnold to get the history right? I don't think we do. Benedict Arnold was a traitor, and nothing in my book certainly exonerates him in any way from the treason that he committed. In fact, I think his treason was probably worse than most people think. So we don't owe him anything, but we owe it to ourselves to get the history right and to iron out the discrepancies that result from the fact that Benedict Arnold was a paradox. He was a hero and he was a villain. He promoted the revolution, he tried to destroy the revolution. And was always been a difficult thing for people to get their minds around, and particularly in the early days, they tried to deny that there was anything heroic about him. He was just a traitor. And that is the image of Benedict Arnold that has gotten pretty much established in the minds of the public. And to make him just a traitor, they had to suggest that his accomplishments were insignificant, or that his participation in them was minimal, or that his motives were suspect. And in some of the early biographies, they even said he was a nasty little boy, and therefore he must have been a traitor from the cradle. So these are distortions of history. Some of them have been debunked easily. Some of them have really gotten into the history books. And I think another reason to pay attention to Arnold is that paradox is a big part of history. The simple form of history, what I'd say history for children, like the Parson Weems form of history, where George Washington never told a lie, is really aimed at children. For adults, history is paradox, it is conflict, it is people changing their mind, it's nuances that are important, particularly because our history is full of paradoxical characters. Just in the Revolutionary War, somebody like Aaron Burr, Ethan Allen himself, General Charles Lee, they weren't as egregious in committing treason like Benedict Arnold did, but they wavered, they had conflicts, they did good things, they did bad things. I think of somebody like John Brown later on. He tried to free slaves, but he resorted to violence. Was he a good person or a bad person? Well, he was paradoxical. So to look at Benedict Arnold is to begin to understand paradox in history and learn from the example of Arnold, which is important because paradoxical people can be dangerous, and Benedict Arnold certainly was dangerous. So we jump ahead to 1776. This is a replica of one of the gunboats that was on Lake Champlain from a lake that was built by the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And we learned the value of Fort Ticonderoga because the British now are attempting to take over that water corridor that I spoke of. I want to say just briefly that in between there was the invasion of Canada, which Benedict Arnold participated in. I'm not going to discuss the invasion of Canada, but one very local aspect of that was that when the army and the Patriot Army was defeated in Canada at the end of December, and then had to retreat from Canada once the British sent an army over there, they were having an epidemic of smallpox. And they landed back in Fort Ticonderoga, and they knew enough to isolate the sick soldiers from the healthy soldiers, and they sent them down here to Lake George to what they call the hospital. It was actually some sheds that they hammered together and platforms for the men to lie on. And it was a horrendous ordeal for those who got sick. If they survived, about 10 to 20% would die from it, but Most people survived, but it was a terrible thing to go through, and very little treatment available. And even the treatment that there was not available because of the overwhelming numbers of soldiers that had smallpox. So that happened right here. The British plan to come down Lake Champlain had to wait because Arnold, having taken over Lake Champlain, if they had sent the army down on transports immediately, they would have been vulnerable to American warships. So there began an arms race that summer, and Benedict Arnold was down in Skenesborough in charge of the nautical defenses of Ticonderoga, overseeing the building of gunboats and small sailing ships, the armed sailing ships, to meet the British. The British were building their own warships up in St. John's and the Richelieu River. They had many more resources, a lot more expertise in building boats, and they were building a much bigger fleet with heavy cannon on them. That went out all summer. Finally, Arnold took his small fleet up to the north end of Champlain in August, figuring the British probably ready to come down, and he waited up there for all through the month of September. And they just kept building more and more ships and bigger ships. And as the weather started to get bad in the fall, Arnold pulled back to Valcour Islands, right up there in the south of what's now Plattsburgh. And there's a little bay between Valcour Island and the New York shore, which it's about a mile wide. The Americans were still standing, and the British had not been able to break through their line. But the Americans had expended 3/4 of their ammunition. Many of their boats were damaged. So now what? And Benedict Arnold said, I have a plan. We're going to escape. And the escape from Valcour Bay, they couldn't go to the north because there was shallow water and shoals in the north. They escaped directly through the British blockade, quietly, in the middle of the night, and were able, because of Arnold's foresight, to break out down and get down farther down the lake. There was more fighting on Lake Champlain. The American fleet was largely destroyed, but the outcome of the campaign was that by the time the British moved their army down towards Ticonderoga, they actually landed at Crown Point, it was too late in the season. They felt that they were afraid. It was getting on to November. They were afraid the lake would freeze and they would be trapped down there. So they decided rather than start a siege of Ticonderoga in November, they would go back to Canada and renew the whole operation in the spring. So the campaign in the north in 1776 was a complete success in the sense that it stopped that invasion and the takeover of that water corridor. So what was this an important achievement? All we have to do is look at the other end of the water corridor. This is New York City. George Washington lost the Battle of Brooklyn, the largest single battle of the entire Revolutionary War. He was pushed out of New York City. He was pushed off of Manhattan. He fought in White Plains, then went over to New Jersey, was pushed across the entire state of New Jersey, and then ended up down there in Pennsylvania. This 20,000 man army had shrunk to 3,000 men. And he wrote a letter to his brother. He said, I think the game is pretty near up. And if he'd had to contend with an invasion coming down the Hudson River from the north, which is what the British intended, I think it would have been curtains for him, but instead Benedict Arnold, along with General Gates, who was in command of Ticonderoga, came down with more than 600 men from Ticonderoga, no longer needed, and they went by boat to Kingston, and then they marched the rest of the way out to join George Washington's army in Pennsylvania. Some of the men who fought at Valcour Island also crossed the Delaware on Christmas night and participated in George Washington's really most spectacular victory at Trenton the next day. Arnold was not among them because he had been sent off on another assignment. So what do they say in the history books? I can't say that it's just a footnote, because recently there was a book called Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty, that I wrote myself. But as I was researching that book, I was surprised. It's actually a pretty good book. I recommend it. I was surprised at how little had been written about that campaign previously. And I picked up David McCullough's book, 1776, and I thought, well, he'll have a lot of the facts in there. And I have a great respect for David McCullough. He's a great writer and great historian. And he didn't slight the campaign in the North. He just didn't mention it whatsoever. He didn't, no mention of Benedict Arnold or all the fighting that went on up there. And I think that he didn't want to taint the glorious story of George Washington and crossing the Delaware with the treason of Benedict Arnold. So there was a way in which subtly Arnold's treason really distorts our view of history. Now jump forward to 1777, and Benedict Arnold decides to resign his commission in the Continental Army. He's very dissatisfied over the promotions he's got, particularly after all the effort that he put in on Lake Champlain and fighting up there. Congress rewarded him by not promoting him, but promoting junior officers over him, which is, in the military, that's a slap in the face to any officer to have your subordinates suddenly you're ordering you around. The situation in Congress Congress controlled the promotions then as it does now, and George Washington, he read about him in the newspaper. They didn't even consult him. And it was a lot of politics. They tried to balance the seniority or merit or how many troops the different states had supplied. And these different criteria essentially made it for a political decision that Arnold just couldn't accept it. I thought it was sort of interesting in the last several weeks and months that Congress was again involved in disputes over military promotions. So Arnold wrote out his resignation and went down to Philadelphia and handed in to Congress, and he was pretty much finished with the war, except that the day he handed in his resignation, news arrived that in Philadelphia that Fort Ticonderoga had fallen, and General John Burgoyne was coming down the original plan. There was now no resistance on Lake Champlain because the American fleet had largely been wiped out, and he took Fort Ticonderoga quite easily at a 7,000-man army, a very heavy train of artillery, and he was on the march towards Albany. Arnold forgot about his resignation, jumped on a horse, rode up to join General Gates, who was in command of the North, and the two of them decided to meet Burgoyne at what's marked Bemis Heights here, the high ground a few miles south of of the village of Saratoga, which today is Schuylerville. They fought 2 battles. In both battles, Burgoyne tried to sweep around the left end of the American lines, and in both battles, Benedict Arnold was in command of the left division. In the first battle on September 19th, Arnold stopped Burgoyne cold and inflicted heavy casualties. And on the second battle on October 7th, he decisively defeated Burgoyne and then led a charge into the British field fortifications, personally led the charge, broke through and put Burgoyne in a position where he had to do what he said he would never do, which was to retreat. And Benedict Arnold was severely wounded in that battle. He had a bullet shattered his leg bone, but Burgoyne, 10 days later, had to surrender his entire army to General Gates. So, was that an important achievement? Well, it's referred to as the turning point of the Revolutionary War. It certainly did change the complexion of the war, brought the French in. Time magazine judged that the Battle of Saratoga was the single most important battle fought anywhere in the world in the last 1,000 years. So, it sounds pretty important. And what do they say in the history books? Well, they can't say that it wasn't important, so they diminish and have over the years diminished Arnold's role in the battle. There's stories based on very little evidence that he was drunk, he was sulking in his cabin, he had been relieved of his command. He was, they can't say he wasn't on the field at all because he was wounded there, so they say he was out there riding around like a crazy man. These are stories that worked their way into various histories of the Battle of Saratoga. Today, that idea is changing. There's been even new evidence that's come up in the last few years, and I think many historians are coming around to the idea that Benedict Arnold was the essential man in the essential battle of the Revolutionary War. 3 years later, in 1780, we come to the one thing that everybody knows about Benedict Arnold. He went over to the British. This is an effigy that was carted around down in Philadelphia that shows him not only two-faced, but holding a mask and the devil behind him on his way to the gallows. The country was shocked by Benedict Arnold's committing treason. He was a very big celebrity, as celebrities went in those days, comparable almost with George Washington. Everybody knew him. For him to go over to the British was really knocked the wind out of a lot of patriots. And the question, of course, is why did he do it? There's been many ideas put forth. A lot of historians have their favorite theory. Some say it was for the money that the British paid him. He was intending to come over their side and hand over West Point. Some say that his wife made him do it. He married a 19-year-old Peggy Shippen from Philadelphia, who was somewhat of a loyalist, leaning in her sentiments. Some said it was the French alliance. Arnold had been brought up, as many people then were brought up, hating the French. The French were the enemy when he was a child. Some said he didn't like the idea of independence. Some said that he was disgruntled over his treatment by Congress and didn't, the way he had been promoted or not promoted. I've looked over those theories. I discuss a lot of the factors in the book. My own answer to that question is, I don't know. You know, I think Benedict Arnold is an enigma, and I think that is one of the aspects of history, is that not everything is going to have an answer. And I sometimes wonder if Benedict Arnold himself even knew why he did it. But he did it. And because he never did anything by halves, he got command of the lower Hudson Valley up around that area up there, which included West Point, and he offered to allow the British to take it over. And that was the plot. Took quite a while, many months of negotiations and getting ready. West Point, of course, in those days was not a military academy. It was a very critical fort guarding the Hudson River. The plot came to fruition in September 1780, and William Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays about history, but sometimes history creates its own dramas. And I think the unfolding of Arnold's plot is one of those really dramatic situations in American history. It was a Thursday night. He went down into neutral territory to meet with the head of British intelligence down there. If you can see, this is at Haverstraw, and they were negotiating the handover. That was Major John Andre, who was the head of the intelligence for the British, and he'd come up there on a British ship. They negotiated. Arnold told them how to take over the fort, gave them a map of the fort that he'd drawn himself, troop deployments, other documents. He told Andre to put these documents in his boot. Then Arnold went home back to his headquarters that was on the east side of the Hudson River, and Major Andre, after some delay, crossed over on the ferry, Sea King's Ferry up there near Peekskill, and started riding down the east side of the Hudson back toward the British lines. He was very excited, but he was very nervous. He was excited because he had pulled off the biggest intelligence coup of the war that was going to make his career and really make his life. And he was nervous because to get back to the British lines down by New York, he had to go through no man's land, which was Westchester County. And that area was patrolled by both militia from both sides. And he got as far as Tarrytown, about there, just north of Tarrytown, and sure enough, 3 militiamen jumped out, stopped him, pointed muskets at him. Major Andre made the mistake of saying, "Well, I hope you're of our party." And so one of the militiamen, who was not as dumb as he looked, said, "Oh yeah, what party is that?" So now Major Andre had to guess, and he said, "The lower party," meaning the English down in New York. And the militiaman said, "We're Americans, get down." They searched him. This is an artist's depiction of what happened. They found the documents in his boot. He offered them bribes. They refused to take the bribes. And they took him over to their commanding officer, who was Colonel Jameson. And Colonel Jameson, in my opinion, was a little slow on the uptake, because the first thing he did was to write a letter to his commanding officer, Benedict Arnold. And it was one of these, "There's something suspicious going on down here, boss." Well, then he started to think. And he's looking over the documents. He said, "Well, wait a minute, this is Benedict Arnold's handwriting on his maps." And And so he decided to cover his rear end, he would send everything to George Washington. So he sent the documents and another letter to George Washington on a different courier. This is where the plot twist comes in that Shakespeare would have thought of. George Washington was not in the American camp over on the New Jersey border. He had gone out to Hartford, Connecticut to meet with French officers and was on his way back. So this is now Sunday, and George Washington was scheduled to have breakfast on Monday morning with Benedict Arnold. And then they were going to go across and inspect West Point. So you have a rather tense situation where you have two couriers separately heading towards Arnold's headquarters, which is marked here, Beverly Robinson House, who's down here on the opposite side from West Point, because the one courier has found out that's where Washington can be found. And Washington, coming from the north, expecting to have breakfast with Benedict Arnold. Some of Washington's aides arrived at Arnold's headquarters. They said, General Washington's just up the road, get ready, he'll be here in a few minutes. At that point, a courier walks in and hands a letter to Benedict Arnold. Arnold reads the letter, tells his wife, I gotta go. And he tells everybody else, I'm going to West Point, over to West Point, have General Washington wait. And he goes down by horseback down to here to the landing, and jumps in his boat and tells his crew to row as fast as they can southward. Washington arrives, Arnold's not there. Where is he? Went to West Point. Washington says, okay, we'll go over and do the inspection now. He takes his entire entourage across. They get over to West Point, and they haven't seen Arnold in 2 days there. And the fortifications at West Point are falling down. Arnold was supposed to be building up the fortifications. And there's not enough men there to defend the fort. And Washington, looking over all this, he later described his own thinking, and he said, my mind misgave me, but I had not the least idea of the real cause. And I think we can all appreciate that feeling of there's something very wrong here, but I just can't put my finger on what it is. So the imperturbable George Washington decided to go back to Arnold's headquarters and take a nap. And you know, he went up before he lied down in bed. A courier arrived with the other letter, with the documents. He looked them over. He immediately knew what had happened. He called in Henry Knox, his most trusted subordinate, and he said, Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust now? And it was not a rhetorical question, because at that point, Washington didn't know who was involved in the plot and how far it went. So he sent Alexander Hamilton tearing down the Hudson River on horseback to try to catch up with Arnold and apprehend him. And he sent a message over to the army to get men marching quickly up towards West Point. And then began the real drama. Arnold's wife, former Peggy Shippen, now Peggy Arnold, and this coincidentally was a drawing made by Major Andre himself back in the days when the British occupied Pennsylvania and Peggy was flirting with British officers. She started tearing her clothes off and screaming. She had to see Washington. They were going to kill her baby. she was having an hysterical fit. They thought, because of the shock of her husband's treason, and officers couldn't imagine that a woman particularly would be so devious, that she would have been in on the plot the whole time and was trying to help her husband escape. And he did escape, and he got down to a British ship. He was made a brigadier general in the British Army. He fought for the British against the Americans for a year, and then went over to England, and he never set foot in America again. Major Andre was quite a good artist. This was a self-portrait he drew while he was waiting for his trial, which happened fairly quickly, and he was then hanged as a spy because he had been in civilian clothing. The men who captured Andre were given these medals, were the first military decoration in American history that was actually awarded. That they made up silver medals for the 3 men, and they actually got pensions as well, with the word fidelity on them as a indication of, that they had stayed true to the cause when Arnold had gone over to the enemy. Very soon after the treason was revealed, one of Arnold's aides said, "Wouldn't it have been better if the bullet that went through his leg at Saratoga had gone through his heart?" And historians down the years have repeated a similar sentiment, that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would be remembered as one of our greatest military heroes. And I think from the achievements I've talked about today, you can see there's a logic to that reasoning, but I don't think it's true. I think that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would have been forgotten. Just like Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, Israel Putnam, Richard Montgomery, all the great heroes of the Revolution that are today not really remembered by the general public. I live farther down in the Hudson Valley. We have Putnam County, we have Greene County, we have Montgomery County, we have Sullivan County. But if you ask people, often they're not really very clear about who these counties were named after. So I'm hopeful that as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, some new attention can be given to those who just did the fighting. Because we're going to remember Benedict Arnold, certainly. But what about all the others? And particularly the men who were in the ranks, who fought a very difficult war in order to create a country. And I think today, given the situation in the country today, it's even more important to go back and look at what they were fighting for in the Revolution. The ideas were so world-shaking. The idea that everyone is created equal was really revolutionary ideas that have really been the bulwark of the country for ever since. So if you read some of the diaries and letters of those days, they often say that they felt that they were fighting for the freedom of generations unborn. They use that phrase. And we are those generations. And they were fighting for us. Thank you. And I'd love to take a few questions. I want to just point out that anybody that didn't get a book, that wants to buy a book or a signed copy, can come up afterwards. Blaze is here from Black Walnut Books in Glens Falls. Always good to patronize your local bookstores. And any questions, comments, or observations, I'd be happy to talk about. Yeah.
I do have a comment. You're standing in Warren County, which is named after Joseph Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the most forgotten founding fathers before George Washington.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I didn't name everything. I actually grew up in Wayne County, which is up near Rochester, and nobody talked about Anthony Wayne there. We never learned why was Mad Anthony Wayne mad. But yeah, the names survive, but the people, yeah.
Do you think that's because New England took control of the whole idea of revolution?
Well,
after the Civil War, everything changed as far as history.
I was interested the fact that in New England there are very few. There isn't a Warren County or up in New England because it was already settled up there.
Yes. Yeah.
Everything, you go out Knoxville, Tennessee. Well, the places in the West are the ones that were named after the heroes because they were so heroic. They were so well remembered in the 19th century when it was being settled. So I think that was a big factor too. Yeah.
One of the biggest distractors of Benedict Arnold was James Wilkinson. Can you tell us your feelings about General Wilkinson?
Wilkinson, who wrote a very detailed memoir, I guess you'd say, of the war. He had been an aide to General Gates at a pretty young age. Got involved in many other intrigues later in his life. He's a frustrating person to read because sometimes he seems to be telling what is obvious, straightforward accounts of what happened, and other times he seems to be making things up, and it's very hard to extract. And I guess I, like some, like any historian, you have to judge, does this have other references, is this backed up by other references or not, when you use him as a source. But sort of an interesting character, but yeah, go ahead.
Teddy Roosevelt called him the worst scoundrel in American history.